Hey guys, tonight we are traveling back to a time when food wasn't Instagrammable, gluten free wasn't a thing, and dinner often looked and tasted like wet cardboard. You're sitting in the cold stone hall of a muddy village. Your hands are already sore from chopping wood all morning, and your stomach is making that hollow, echoey sound. That means it's getting desperate. Finally, someone brings you dinner. It's a bowl, it's warm. That's promising. You lean in. It's cray, thicker than water, thinner than pudding. It smells like, well, not bad, but definitely not good. Maybe like someone whispered the word onion over a bucket of wet oats. Welcome to your evening meal. Gruel. Again. Surprise? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pick up your spoon. Oh, wait. No, you don't have one. Nobody does. You use your hands. Or if you're lucky, maybe a wooden shard carved into a vaguely scoopy shape. It still smells like the fish someone ate last week. The hall around you is dim, smoky, and loud. Your neighbor is slurping so hard, it's like he's auditioning to be a drain pipe. Across from you, a child is dipping dry bread into her bowl and giving you 1,000-yard stare, as if to say, I've seen things. You nod, so have you. This, dear listener, is dinner for the average medieval peasant. And it wasn't just sometimes. It was all the time. Day in, day out, your meals were about as exciting as a damp sponge. Gruel, also called pottage or porridge, depending on who's talking and how desperate they are to make it sound exotic, was the universal goop of the people. A big pot would sit on the hearth, bubbling for days, topped off with whatever you could scrounge. Got a handful of barley? Throw it in. Half an onion? Go nuts. That piece of cabbage that fell under the table last week. Rinse it first, maybe, and toss it in. And that's breakfast, lunch, and dinner sorted. You don't get seconds. You don't get variety. You just get gruel forever. Now here's the thing. Food wasn't just bad. It was exhausting. You didn't just pop into the pantry and grab a snack. You had to grow it, harvest it, dry it, store it, defend it from rats, cook it, and hope the fire didn't go out halfway through. And if you wanted meat, we'll get to that fantasy soon. For now, your daily calories come from this porridge-like substance that somehow manages to be both watery and chewy. It fills your belly, yes, but it doesn't spark joy. It's fuel, not flavor, and it's full of what historians politely call natural inclusions, like bits of grit from the grindstone, or the occasional weevil, or maybe a tiny pebble which has probably chipped a molar or two. Dental care. Please. Your dentist is a sharp stick and a strong friend. You're probably wondering, why didn't they just spice things up? Add a little garlic, some herbs. Ah, that's adorable. You're lucky if you even know what garlic is. Spices were mostly reserved for the elite. Common folks made do with leeks, wild onions, maybe some bitter herbs foraged from the hedgerow, and if they were feeling really spicy, mustard seeds. Otherwise, bland was the flavor profile. Bland and vaguely smoky, because everything was cooked over an open fire, and your ceiling is basically a soot sponge. And even if you wanted to shake things up, you couldn't. There's no fridge, no freezer, no supermarkets. If it's not growing out of the ground, roaming the woods, or stinking up the root cellar, you're out of luck. Some communities did trade with passing merchants, and occasionally you might taste something exotic. But don't hold your breath. If you lived more than a 2-day walk from a trade route, you probably never even smelled pepper, which, by the way, was once considered currency. That's right, black pepper was so rare and pricey, it was literally used to pay rent. Still hungry? Great. Let's talk about what you eat after dinner. Or rather, what you don't. There's no dessert, no cookies, no chocolate, no late night snacks, unless you count gnawing on a turnip in the dark. Even fruit was seasonal, scarce, and often fermented into something barely drinkable. Your idea of a treat? A slice of bread that wasn't rock hard. And don't even think about asking for more. There's no all-you-can-eat buffet. You eat what you're given, and you're grateful. Because there are years, yes, entire years, when the crops fail, when the grain goes moldy, when the rivers flood or freeze. And then, my friend, it's not just boring, it's deadly. Historians still argue whether the average medieval diet was enough to sustain an adult through hard labor. But judging by the skeletal remains, malnutrition wasn't exactly uncommon. You'd think all this would lead people to complain, revolt, demand better. But honestly, most folks didn't know it could be better. When every day is a slog through muddy fields and smoky kitchens, your expectations shift. You stop dreaming about flavor and start hoping for fullness. And maybe, just maybe, a day without food poisoning. Because fun fact, food safety wasn't a thing. If it didn't crawl away on its own, it was probably edible. Probably. We'll get to that charming detail in another section. But for now, you scrape your bowl clean. The girl with the bread stare is still watching you, and she's not blinking. You nod again solemnly. You've both survived another meal. As the hall quiets and the fire dims, you curl up on your straw-stuffed bedroll. Your stomach is not full, but it's not growling. And in the world of medieval cuisine, that's what we call a 5-star dining experience. The next morning, you wake up sore, cold, and slightly confused about whether your back hurts from the straw mattress or just from existing in the Middle Ages. Breakfast? Oh, you sweet modern soul. You're imagining toast, eggs, maybe a little butter and jam. Stop it. What you're actually having is bread. Not fresh from the bakery bread. Not sourdough starter bread. Not even stale baguette bread. This is medieval bread, baby. And it could kill you. You reach for the coarse, flat lump on the table. It's dense, heavy, feels more like a paving stone than anything digestible. This isn't the stuff of brunch dreams. It's a survival tool, a doorstop that just happens to contain calories. You bite down. Immediate regret. The crust is so tough it feels like chewing leather. And inside, well, you'd think it might be soft. You would be wrong. It's dry, crumbly, and gritty. Why? Because medieval mills ground grain between giant stones. That left behind little shards of rock mixed in with the flour, which means your breakfast might include minerals, actual, tooth-breaking minerals. Dental hygiene, by the way, hasn't evolved past hope you die before your molars rot. And here you are, starting the day with a gravel sandwich. Bread was the staple of nearly every medieval diet. Rich or poor, noble or peasant, you ate bread. But not all bread was created equal. The lower your status, the darker and rougher your loaf. Poor folks made bread from rye, barley, oats, or whatever filler they could find. Acorns, beans, even ground up tree bark in hard times. If you were rich, you got the good stuff. Fine white bread called manchet, made from well-sifted wheat flour. If you were poor, you got something closer to a brick that had been left in a riverbed too long. Still, you chew, slowly, carefully, because even though it tastes like regret and powdered stone, it might be the only solid thing you eat today. And no, there's no butter. Butter is rare, expensive, and precious. If you have a cow, which you don't, you might churn a little. But it's going to be sour, chunky, and warm. If you're lucky. Sometimes, folks soak their bread in broth or ale to soften it. That doesn't help the flavor, but at least it prevents accidental dental surgery. And if you're really on the brink, you might make soaps, chunks of bread dropped into greasy drippings, or thin stew, the medieval equivalent of soggy cereal. But even bread had rules. In feasts, for example, thick slices of bread were used as edible plates, called trenchers. After the meal, these grease-soaked slabs were either eaten, given to the poor, or if they were too gross, tossed to dogs. So yeah, even dogs had a chance of getting second-hand gravy bread. Lucky mutts. Now, you might think, okay, at least it's homemade, right? Natural, organic, small batch. Stop. Just stop. grain could be infected with fungi. Ever heard of ergot? It's a lovely little mold that grows on rye and, when eaten, causes convulsions, hallucinations, and death. Historians still argue whether entire villages were occasionally wiped out or driven into madness by this fungus. And some believe it inspired tales of witchcraft and curses. So every time you bite into a slice of rye bread, you might also be biting into a psychedelic death spore. But hey, it's filling. Of course, there's a seasonal element to all of this. Bread doesn't just appear. You have to grow the grain, wait for harvest, grind it, store it, keep it dry, avoid the rats, and hope it lasts through the winter. And winter is bread's villain origin story. You see, there was something called the Hungry Gap. This was the time between spring planting and the summer harvest, usually April to June, when old stores ran out and nothing new had grown yet. Families would stretch their supply of flour with whatever was at hand: weeds, old beans, sawdust. Yes, actual sawdust in desperate times, and even clay. And still, bread had to be made. There were baking days, sometimes shared among neighbors. Communal ovens were a thing. If you didn't have one, you carried your dough across the village, hoping some generous soul would lend you fire time. Or if you lived near a monastery, the monks might bake for you. For a fee, of course. Nothing's free. Not even salvation, apparently. And let's not forget the legal side of bread. The assize of bread and ale. A real medieval law regulated how much a loaf should weigh, how much it should cost, and what it should contain. Bakers who cheated customers might get dunked in rivers or paraded through town with bad loaves tied around their necks. Imagine being publicly shamed by your own bad carbs. Now you're sitting back at the breakfast table, picking crumbs from your tunic and wondering, what's for lunch? Spoiler alert, more bread. You carry a hard hunk in your pouch, like an edible rock. Some people slice their bread with the same knife they used for hunting, skinning, and possibly self-defense. You tuck the knife into your belt and head to the fields. The sun is climbing. You're sweating. Your stomach's already growling again. You chew slowly, methodically. You wonder, again, why the bread tastes like sand and sorrow. You wonder if your teeth will make it to your 30s. You wonder if there's a better life. And somewhere in the distance, a noble is eating fresh manchet with cheese and honey. But not you. You've got your hardtack, your survival loaf, your medieval energy bar, full of hope and maybe rocks. You keep walking, because you've got miles to go, chores to finish, and, let's be honest, there's no point going home early. Dinner will just be another bowl of pottage and, yes, another chunk of bread. Honestly, you're starting to miss the gruel. You're back from the fields now, covered in sweat, bits of hay, and the quiet ache of someone who's done too much for too little. You sit again at that same uneven table. Another meal, another letdown. Today, someone whispers the sacred word, meat. You blink. Meat? Real meat? Don't get too excited. Because if you're imagining a juicy steak or crispy chicken thigh, reel it in. You're not royalty. You're not even rich adjacent. So what's for dinner? Maybe it's pork, leftover, stringy and gray. Maybe it's something that used to quack, cluck, or squeal. More likely, it's a chunk of salted something that's been hanging from a smoky rafter for 4 months and might now be more mold than meat. Meat in the Middle Ages was rare for common folks. You lived on bread, beans, pottage, and hope. Meat was a celebration, a feast day, a wedding, a funeral, or when the village pig keeled over from old age. Then it was all hands on deck, and every part got used. Every part. You didn't waste anything. Tongue, feet, organs, even blood. Blood pudding, by the way, was considered a delicacy. You might not love it, but if the pig died peacefully and you didn't have to share, it could be the highlight of your year. Still, you mostly got your protein from beans or cheese when available. A peasant family might raise a few chickens, but those were better for eggs than meat. Killing one meant no more eggs, and fewer eggs meant fewer tiny chickens to eventually not eat later. You could go hunting, but here's the twist. Most forests were off limits. The king and his nobles reserved them for sport. That's right. You couldn't legally hunt a deer unless you were a deer. Caught poaching, that's a fast track to fines, prison, or worse. Historians still argue whether peasants regularly risked it anyway. Some say yes, others say no, and a few say, well, you'd be stupid not to. So unless you had a rebellious streak and decent aim, wild game was a fantasy. And fishing? Oh, get in line. Everyone's fishing. We'll talk about that salty monotony soon. What about cows then? Surely the village had a cow. Maybe one, maybe. And that cow had a job, providing milk. Killing her for beef would be like trading your smartphone for firewood. Sure, you'd be warm once, but then you'd be screwed for the rest of the year. But let's say, miracle of miracles, you get a bit of meat. There's a small piece of pork belly in tonight's stew. You can smell it. It's meaty, smoky. You stare at it, trembling with anticipation. You take a bite. Salty, tough, weirdly chewy. But it's meat, and your brain does that caveman thing where it lights up like a festival. You feel full, almost powerful. Don't get used to it, because meat doesn't just spoil quickly, it goes evil. No fridges, remember? So unless it's salted, smoked, dried, or buried in a snowbank, it turns faster than medieval gossip. That's why most meat was overpreserved, salty enough to suck the moisture right out of your face. And speaking of preservation, some folks had larders, cold storage rooms lined with stone, sometimes underground. But unless you lived in a manor or were pals with the local monk, you didn't have one. Your cold storage was a wooden box in the least sunny part of your hut, which doubled as a mouse hotel. You remember last week, someone found a rat in the salted pork barrel. The rat was also salted. It happens. If meat was rare, fresh meat was practically mythical. Most of it had traveled, sat, and changed color before it even hit the pot. Boiling was the solution to everything. Meat, boil it. Bread too stale. Boil it. Mood, boil it. And let's not forget, people believed cooking meat a certain way kept sickness away. Medieval medicine was experimental. You'd hear things like, don't eat too much rabbit, it dries out the body. Or, lamb is hot and moist, which is good, unless you're a melancholy type. Yes, food was tied to the four humors, those strange bodily fluids that supposedly governed your mood, health, and personality. So you didn't just eat for hunger. You ate strategically, or more often, desperately. Now, on rare occasions, like a wedding, festival, or the annual village feast, you'd get something wild. A roast, a whole pig, maybe. Chickens, sometimes even game. And for a brief, shining moment, everyone would sit, chew, and remember what real food could taste like. Then the moment passed. Leftovers were stewed into pottage again. Bones were saved to flavor broth. Fat was rendered and stored. And you went back to your usual routine, dreaming about meat you'd never taste again. Oh, and one more thing. Some people did get meat more often. The nobility, the clergy, anyone with land, influence, or enough coin to buy a whole cow and a servant to cook it. You've heard tales of their tables. Turkeys stuffed with pheasants, stuffed with pigeons, stuffed with something even smaller. Meat pies topped with gilded pastry. Roasted boar served with golden apples. Stuff that sounds made up, but wasn't. They had access, money, and power. But you've got a scrap of bacon and a whisper of beef fat clinging to a potato. Eat slow. Some nights, when your stomach's rumbling, you might even dream about the forbidden meat, like dog or hedgehog. Yes, people sometimes ate those, especially when famine hit. Starvation turns anything into a delicacy. Historians still argue whether medieval people had structured taboos around certain meats, or if they just played it by ear or paw. Tonight, you're finishing your stew. A few stray lentils, one sliver of meat. You lick the spoon. The girl from earlier is back, and she's watching you again. Still hasn't blinked. You nod. You understand. Meat is hope. Meat is power. Meat is probably not happening again for a very long time. Your stomach is still humming from that rare scrap of meat. It's not full exactly, but it's temporarily satisfied, like your body knows it just got a high score in survival, but you're still haunted by a thought: flavor. Because here's the real punchline. Even when food wasn't rotten, gritty, or rodent adjacent, it still tasted like nothing. Enter spices, or rather, the lack thereof. You glance at your bowl of pottage. Again, same beige sludge. If this had a flavor, it would be called wet hay with dreams. So you imagine just a pinch of pepper, or a tiny scrape of cinnamon, maybe even a little clove. Now you're really dreaming, because in medieval Europe, spices were not seasoning, they were currency. Pepper could be traded like gold. Nutmeg might cost you a month's wages. And saffron? Forget it. Saffron was more expensive than your life, your neighbor's life, and the entire goat population of your village combined. Unless you were royalty or fabulously wealthy, you didn't have spices. You heard rumors of people putting ginger in their pastries, of nobles flavoring their stews with cinnamon, cardamom, or, brace yourself, mace. You didn't even know what mace was, but it sounded magical. Instead, you get salt, if you're lucky. Not the nice, flaky sea salt in tiny glass jars. No. We are talking rough, rock-like, probably mined by a surf salt. The kind that needs to be smashed with a hammer and dissolved in boiling water to be remotely edible. Even salt wasn't guaranteed. Entire wars were fought over salt rights. The word salary even comes from sal, Latin for salt. That's how precious it was. If your region didn't have easy access, you bartered for it, traded, maybe begged or stole. The rich, of course, didn't just have spices, they flaunted them. Dishes loaded with pepper, cloves, and exotic herbs were used to show off wealth, not taste. It was culinary peacocking. If your goose had 4 different spice blends, it meant you were important enough to spend a small fortune just to confuse your palate. Some feasts were so spice-heavy that guests couldn't even tell what meat they were eating. Historians still argue whether this was intentional, flavor camouflage, or just a desperate attempt to overpower the fact that the meat was questionable. So how did spices even get here? Trade routes. Long, dangerous, often bloody trade routes. Spices came from India, Sri Lanka, the Middle East, North Africa, places that most Europeans had only heard about in stories. To get from a farm in Kerala to your medieval kitchen, peppercorns had to cross deserts, oceans, and bandits. Merchants hoarded them. Kings taxed them. Thieves died for them. And you smelled them once when a monk walked through the village carrying a parcel of cinnamon like it was holy relics. There were some local options, though. Medieval gardens grew herbs like parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme. Yes, just like the song, These added a little brightness, sure, but they didn't travel well, and they weren't preserved, which means that for most of the year, you're stuck with dried, dusty leaves that taste like old parchment. You try adding wild mustard to your meal. It burns a little. It's exciting. It's gone too fast. The truth is, food was functional. The goal wasn't to delight your taste buds. It was to stay alive, keep working, and maybe not faint in the fields tomorrow. Flavor was a bonus, a fantasy. And in the odd case that someone in your village did get a shipment of spices, maybe a trader passed through, or the local lord had a leftover sack, people would lose their minds. A stew seasoned with actual pepper. That was church tier celebration. You'd close your eyes and savor every bite. You'd lick the spoon and scrape the bowl. You'd talk about it for months. Remember that one time, you'd say dreamily, and the others would nod. Everyone would remember. Of course, sometimes people tried to fake it. Spice imposters were everywhere. Ground seeds passed off as pepper. Colored roots pretending to be saffron. Dried, crushed bark sold as cinnamon. You didn't really know what you were getting, unless you had money, connections, or a tongue trained to detect fraud. Monasteries sometimes kept spices under lock and key, using them in medicine or for ceremonial food, which meant, ironically, monks who took vows of poverty might be the only people in a 50-mile radius with access to decent seasoning. But that's fine. You've adapted. You've trained yourself to enjoy the subtle differences between barley mush, rye mush, and oat mush. You've convinced yourself that overboiled leek is kind of sweet. You tell people that pickled cabbage has depth. And honestly, you're not entirely lying. When you live with so little, your body finds joy in survival. Your brain rewires itself to find comfort in warmth, texture, salt. Not pleasure, but peace. And that's something, right? Still, every now and then, when the wind shifts just right and you smell something drifting from the manor house, something complex, spicy, unidentifiable, you close your eyes and imagine what it would be like to have a whole cupboard of flavor, to sprinkle instead of scrape, to enjoy instead of endure. And then your pottage burns at the bottom of the pot, and someone tells you to stop daydreaming and get more firewood. You're standing over a barrel now, squinting into the briny abyss. It smells like something that once lived, died, and is now contemplating a comeback. Fish, again. You're not even near the coast, but thanks to church law, you're basically on a forced seafood diet half the week, every week. Sometimes more. It's Friday, so meat is off the table. Also gone flavor, texture, and the will to live. So you dig into a hunk of pickled herring. It's gray, it's damp, and it tastes like salty regret, wrapped in old socks. But you chew, because not eating fish isn't just a personal choice, it's a spiritual violation. The medieval church had very clear rules. No meat on Fridays, on holy days, during Lent, and sometimes during random fasts that felt more like divine experiments in misery. Why? Because abstaining from meat was seen as purifying, humbling, a reminder that you were closer to God when you were further from bacon. But here's the twist. Fish didn't count as meat. Nobody really knows why. Historians still argue whether it was about ancient biology, cultural tradition, or just a really persistent lobby from the fishing industry. But somehow, sea creatures got a spiritual hall pass. And so, the medieval diet swam. If you were lucky, you got something fresh, maybe trout from a local stream, or an eel pulled from a muddy bank. Eels, by the way, were weirdly popular. Slippery, boneless, and disturbingly toothy. They were served roasted, boiled, jellied, or, if things got truly bleak, raw. If you were unlucky, you got the barrel stuff. Pickled, salted, fermented. The kind of fish that came with its own emotional baggage. Salt cod was king. Tried so hard it could break an axe. It had to be soaked for days, beaten with a hammer, and boiled within an inch of its afterlife to become edible. Even then, it still tasted like leather dipped in seawater. But it filled you up, mostly. Monasteries, castles, and large towns often had their own fish ponds, artificial ones. Man-made lakes stocked with carp, tench, and pike, raised like scaly livestock. It was a mark of wealth to grow your own fish. Which is funny, because by the time it hit your plate, it still tasted like swamp. And just to keep things weird, some church officials decided that certain semi-aquatic animals also counted as fish. Beavers, sure, they swim. Go ahead. Puffins, they nest on cliffs near water. Good enough. Historians still argue over how widespread these loopholes were. But it's clear that medieval theologians had a flexible imagination when it came to defining not meat. You look down at your plate, if you can call a warped wooden plank a plate, and see a pile of limp, oily fish chunks swimming in their own sadness. It's not hot, it's not cold. It's that confusing medieval room temperature that exists somewhere between lukewarm and damp sock. You close your eyes and chew. Someone next to you is whispering about oysters, a rare treat from the coast, eaten raw with vinegar and pepper. You try to imagine it, but your brain refuses. You've only ever eaten oysters once. You were 9. You were violently ill. Still worth it. On feast days, when fish was allowed, but you had a bit of flair, you might see dishes that tried to imitate meat. Faux roasts made from molded fish paste, or fish pies sculpted into swans. Not actual swans. That's for the nobles. Just a sad attempt at artistry, made with bones and crust and hope. It's also important to remember most people didn't even like fish. They tolerated it, revered it, maybe, but they weren't hosting sushi nights. You ate it because you had to, because eternal salvation required it, because nothing builds faith faster than desperately trying to pretend a dried herring is dinner. You think of the church calendar, all those fasts, all those forbidden meats. You start counting how many days are left this year where you can legally eat a roast without risking eternal damnation. Answer: not nearly enough. And what about those who lived far from water? Well, dried fish traveled. You could trade for it, buy it, beg it from a monk. But by the time it arrived, it was no longer a fish. It was a concept, a shadow of a memory, rehydrated with stew water and hope. Some towns built fish markets near rivers just to centralize the misery. The smells alone could peel paint off walls. You'd walk past, gagging from the stench, then walk back in because, yep, it's Friday, and you're spiritually obligated to chew a flounder again. And yes, there were recipes. Cookbooks from the time included detailed instructions for preparing fish dishes. But let's be clear, those books were written for rich people. People with access to spices, clean water, actual cookware, and enough servants to disguise bad taste with pretty presentation. You're using the same blackened pot from last week. The fish goes in, the salt goes in, the onion, if you've got it, goes in. Then you boil it for hours or maybe days. The result? A stew that looks like it's already been digested, but it keeps you alive. And somehow, that's enough. You finish your bowl, rinse it with cold water that smells vaguely like duck pond, and pat your stomach. A little. You've done it. You've survived another fish day. Only 43 more to go. You're stirring a pot again. You've been at it for hours. Not because it's complicated, far from it, but because the fire is slow. The water is colder than your outlook on life. And frankly, everything just takes forever. You lean over and inhale. Yep, it's the same stew, the same soupy, sludgy, overcooked thing. It used to be vegetables. Now it's more of a suggestion. A murky blend of root mash, wilted greens, and whatever else was left in the pantry. The texture, imagine porridge, but angrier. The taste, like chewing a warm sigh, because in medieval kitchens, the number one rule was boil everything until it begs for mercy. Boiling wasn't just cooking, it was self-defense. It was how you purified dodgy water, softened impossible grains, and made spoiled meat, mostly not deadly. The longer you boiled, the more confident you could be that you wouldn't drop dead mid-spoonful. So that pot, it's your lifeline. It never leaves the fire. Every day you add to it barley, cabbage, lentils, a bone from last week, a new turnip, a handful of dried peas, some stale bread. The stew never ends. It just evolves. Some families joked It was the same batch from 10 winters ago. Not joking. They might have been right. This was called perpetual stew. A cauldron of bubbling survival, always simmering, always just edible. You try a spoonful, you burn your tongue. Again, the pain helps you feel alive. Of course, there were other cooking methods. You could roast, grill, fry, or bake. In theory. In practice, boiling was the only thing peasants could count on. Ovens were rare and expensive. Frying required oil, which was precious. Roasting was a luxury because meat was rare and fires needed fuel. You didn't exactly have a forest in your backyard. Also, boiling was safe. It masked rot, covered up bad smells, and made things soft enough for your molar-deprived mouth to manage. People weren't exactly flossing back then, but the result? Every meal becomes a textural blur, a beige slurry of food ghosts. It fills your belly, sure, but leaves your spirit gently whimpering. You glance around the kitchen, if you can call it that. It's a smoky corner of your one-room house, with soot-darkened beams and a hearth that belches more ash than warmth. The walls are stone, cold. The floor is dirt. You swear it's moving. Probably mice. The fire crackles, sort of. You toss in another handful of barley and stir. Again. You remember last winter when someone in the village made a stew with spiced vinegar. The whole town talked about it for a week. People came by to sniff it, not to taste, just to sniff. The truth is, medieval food wasn't just bland, it was monochrome. Everything boiled into the same consistency. Color, gone. Texture, surrendered. Flavor? Absolutely not. You could blindfold yourself and not tell if you were eating cabbage, beans, or yesterday's bread. And if you were really down on your luck, you might eat gruel. Not the same as stew. Though it wishes it were, gruel is just thin, barely their porridge. Water boiled with a pinch of oats or flour. Not thick enough to chew, not hearty enough to count. It's the edible equivalent of someone patting you on the back and saying, "At least you tried." Monks lived off it during fasts. Poor folks ate it when everything else ran out. You've had gruel during the hungry gap, and you remember it. You still remember it. Boiled greens? That's another category of sadness. Kale, nettles, beet leaves, all tossed in water until they're limp, brown, and vaguely slimy. You try to spice it up with onion or garlic if you're lucky enough to have them. Usually, though, it's just hot green mush. A slap in the face from nature. Oh, and milk? Don't even get started. Most people couldn't afford to keep a cow. If you got milk, it was raw, unfiltered, and probably hours from turning. Which is why people turned it into cheese or butter as fast as possible, or just boiled it into submission. Are you seeing the theme here? Even drinks weren't spared. You've had ale, barely alcoholic, mildly fermented, barely cold. But you've also had ale soup. Yes, soup made from ale, bread, and a little sugar. It's warm, it's wet, it's confusing. But in winter, it gets you through. Boiling wasn't just practical, it was political. Lords had access to ovens and firewood. You had a pot and a prayer. The ability to bake bread or roast meat meant you had status. You could control heat, control resources, control time. You have a stew pot, and that pot carries everything. Your history, your hopes, your dinner from 3 days ago. You scrape the sides with your spoon, savoring the thick, salty film. Maybe a bean made it in today. Maybe not. Doesn't matter. The heat is nice. Still, every so often, you think of texture. You dream about crunch, something crisp, golden, with layers, or chew, or stretch. Anything other than this hot, sad bath of food puree. And then you stir again, because it's your turn. Because the stew needs feeding. Because if it burns, you've lost the only thing keeping your stomach from giving up entirely. You're not cooking to impress. You're cooking to not die. And in that context, this watery, you're crouched by a garden now, tugging something stubborn from the soil. It resists, like it knows what fate awaits it. You finally yank it free and hold up what may or may not be a carrot. It's lumpy, beige, not orange, kind of smells like feet. This, dear listener, is your vegetable. Not the crisp, colorful, Instagram-worthy kind you might imagine. Medieval vegetables were different. Rougher, bitter, unreliable. Often more guess what this is than bon appetit. You give it a rinse with questionable water and toss it into your stew without ceremony. It'll boil into submission, like everything else. Vegetables in the Middle Ages weren't the stars of the plate. They were background characters. Filler. Survival calories. Grown in small kitchen plots. They were seasonal, fragile, and risky. Not just in terms of supply, but also in terms of safety. You poke at a leaf of something green and slightly fuzzy. Could be sorrel. Could be something toxic. You sniff it, shrug, toss it in anyway. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants had a strong grasp on botany or were just remarkably lucky. You, personally, rely on that one village elder who thinks he knows which mushrooms don't kill you. You've also seen him talk to geese, so maybe don't trust him too much. Your garden gives you cabbages. Those are common, but not the tight, tidy ones you're used to. These are big, loose, leafy, and smell like a bad mood when boiled. Then there are parsnips, turnips, leeks, onions, and garlic. Though garlic is precious, and if you have one clove, you guard it like treasure. Peas and beans, reliable, sort of. When dried, they keep for months. When fresh, they're delicate. and likely to be stolen by rabbits or neighboring children. Either way, they're your protein backup. And herbs? Technically vegetables, but barely. You might grow some parsley, maybe sage. Not for taste. Those are for medicine. Or at least, that's what the herbal book says. Written by a monk who thought sneezing was caused by demons. You pluck a few dandelion greens, not because you want to, because they're there, because they'll boil, because they won't poison you. Probably. In lean seasons, people foraged whatever they could. Nettles, dock leaves, wild garlic, even tree bark. Anything to stretch a pot or thicken a gruel. The thing is, medieval veggies weren't bred for sweetness or juiciness. They were bred to survive. Hardy, gnarled, resistant, just like you. They fought the frost. They endured pests. They tasted like earth and frustration. But they grew. And if they didn't, you starved. Potatoes? Huh. Not here yet. Tomatoes? Not a chance. Corn? That's still living its best life across the Atlantic. Most of the vegetables you know and love, spinach, broccoli, green beans, either didn't exist or weren't widely cultivated. Some were considered suspicious. Eggplants were thought to cause insanity. Tomatoes were called love apples and viewed with fear. Even carrots weren't trusted until someone figured out how to make them orange. The poor mostly ate the roots and leaves. The rich got the tender parts, the hearts of artichokes, the inner leaves of lettuce, baby peas. That's right, even vegetables had a class system. You pull another root from the ground. It's crooked, dirty, and oddly shaped, just like last time. You remember hearing that in some places, people thought vegetables had personalities, that if you pull them the wrong way, they'd resist and turn bitter. Maybe they were right. This one's definitely scowling. And don't forget, the storage situation? Abysmal. No refrigeration. You dig holes in the ground, keep root cellars, hang garlic from rafters. But things go bad fast. Mold, mice, moisture. You open a bin and find your cabbage has liquefied into something that could be classified as a biohazard. You scrape off the worst parts. Boil the rest. Always boil. Sometimes you dream about raw vegetables, crisp, crunchy bites. Something with snap. But you know that's a dangerous game. Raw is risky, especially if your water isn't clean and your hands haven't seen soap in a month. You don't eat raw unless you're desperate or daring. You chew on a raw green onion anyway. It tastes like burning. It's the most excitement you've had all week. Still, veggies do their job. They bulk up meals. They keep scurvy at bay. They add something to the pottage, even if that something is just texture. You think back to last year's famine, when all the crops failed, and you survived off cabbage leaves and dandelion roots. You remember that bitter, pulpy soup you made? Just herbs, weeds, and rainwater. You drank it like it was wine. Now, you don't complain. Not much. You know that if the garden grows, you live. And if it doesn't, you don't. So you pull another turnip. The sky's getting dark. Time to chop it up, toss it into the pot, and hope tomorrow's harvest isn't worse. It probably will be. You lift the cloth and immediately regret it. The smell hits you like a medieval slap to the face, sour, damp, and oddly foot-like. You hold your breath, reach inside the clay pot, and pull out your next course. Cheese. Well, something cheesish. It's soft, too soft, oozing at the edges. Alive, maybe. Definitely moving, probably breathing. Welcome to medieval dairy. You don't exactly eat this cheese. You negotiate with it. A careful nibble, a test of texture. Is it tangy, sharp, or did it cross the line into this should be buried? There's a reason cheese in the Middle Ages wasn't served on wooden boards with grapes and wine. It was more survival strategy than charcuterie fantasy. Let's break it down. Milk doesn't last. In a world without fridges, it's a ticking time bomb. Cows, sheep, and goats only give milk in certain seasons. And what little you collect, it has to be used immediately or transformed. Enter cheese, butter, yogurt, curds, and whey. Fermentation wasn't just trendy, it was how you beat the clock. Turn milk into something that could survive for days, weeks, maybe even months, and you'd bought yourself time and calories. But that came at a cost. Your cheese was unpredictable. The texture, chunky. The smell, sharp. The taste ranged somewhere between interesting and offensive. Especially soft cheeses. They fermented fast, grew rinds, and welcomed mold as part of the party. And don't forget, bacteria wasn't understood. So if your cheese made you sick, you blamed the moon, or witches, or your neighbor, Jeffrey. You stare at your wobbly chunk of cheese and sigh. The goat's milk version last week was better. Drier, tangier, almost crumbly. This one seems angry. Still, you eat it. Because it has protein, fat, salt, and a strange, sour heat that clings to the back of your tongue like bad news. Now here's where things get quirky. Some cheeses were meant to be terrifying. There's evidence of medieval cheeses so ripe they required spoons or had worms. Yes, intentional maggot cheese. Don't worry, we'll keep that one vague. This is bedtime after all. Historians still argue whether these were regional oddities or widely enjoyed. Either way, the concept of acceptable was a moving target. There was hard cheese too, salted, aged, firm enough to crack. Great for travel, storing, or throwing at people who said, "Are you going to eat that?" Monasteries were the Michelin stars of cheese production. Monks had thyme, cows, and, most importantly, cool stone buildings. They aged cheese on purpose, gave it flavor, identity, and sometimes artistry. Some monasteries even had secret cheese recipes passed down like sacred scrolls. That wheel of pungent holiness, it was divine intervention in dairy form. Meanwhile, you had your clay crock of slightly uncooperative goat cheese sweating on the table. In wealthier homes, cheese was paired with fruit, wine, or honey, served after meals as a digestive. You, however, slap it on some black bread and hope it's not possessed. Butter? Don't get too excited. It's even harder to come by. It spoils fast, and churning it is a workout your arms aren't ready for. First, you need cream, already a challenge if you're sharing a cow with 5 other families. Then, you churn for hours. If the weather's wrong or you're unlucky, it doesn't thicken. It just sloshes and mocks you. If you do make butter, you use it sparingly. On feast days, as medicine. Maybe a dab in a stew. It's gold in dairy form. Sometimes people used buttermilk, the tangy leftover liquid, to make griddle cakes or bread. But that assumes you've got grain and a hot griddle. So, not often. Yogurt existed, but it wasn't your plate. It was lumpy, runny, and consumed quickly, or forgotten, and quietly turned into something else. Still, dairy had its place. It was filling, practical, occasionally luxurious, and, if you ignored texture, actually kind of delicious. You finish your cheese. The aftertaste is strong. You feel it in your sinuses. You feel it in your soul. The child next to you is chewing hers like it's rubber. She's grinning. She has no idea this isn't how food is supposed to taste. This is all she's ever known. You wonder how long until someone gets sick again. Someone always gets sick. And yet, you're grateful. Because tonight, the cheese didn't fight back. It wasn't moldy in a threatening way. And there weren't any unexpected guests crawling out of it. That's what you call a dairy victory. You rinse your hands in a basin of lukewarm gray water. Pat your belly. Another meal done. Another chance to live. You stretch out by the hearth. The fire pops. Someone's humming. You feel foolish. And somewhere nearby, a cow moos in the dark. Loud. Guttural. She doesn't know she's the queen of the village. Tomorrow, you'll thank her with a bucket and a prey. You sit up, bleary-eyed, stretching the kind of stretch that suggests your joints have declared mutiny. Morning again. You grope in the dark for something to drink and... Good news, someone hands you a wooden cup. Bad news, it's ale again. Because in the Middle Ages, drinking water could literally kill you. You raise the cup. It's cloudy, slightly warm. Smells faintly of yeast and wet hay. You sip. It's weak, sour, and somehow both fizzy and flat. But it's safe. Or at least, safer. Welcome to breakfast. Ale and maybe a crust of bread. See, water wasn't treated. It ran through sewage, animal pens, and streets. People dumped waste into rivers. Wells were often shallow and shared. Unless you lived near a clear mountain spring, and let's face it, you don't. Water was a microbial roulette wheel. So folks turned to ale, small ale to be precise. It wasn't meant to get you drunk. It was barely alcoholic, maybe 1%. But it was boiled during brewing, which killed off most of the nasty stuff. The yeast also competed with bacteria. It was hydration, calories, and vague comfort in one muddy mug. Even kids drank it, toddlers too. Your 4-year-old nephew once downed 3 cups before breakfast and then fell asleep in a puddle. Hero. But let's rewind a bit. Brewing wasn't easy. It required grain, water, yeast, or wild fermentation if you like to gamble, and time. Usually, women brewed for the household. They were called alewives. You've probably seen one. Flour on her hands, a wooden spoon like a weapon, always yelling at someone to stop touching the mash. Some alewives got good, really good. They sold to neighbors. Some ran informal taverns. A few became rich enough to attract suspicion. And here's where it gets awkward. If a woman made too much money from brewing, she might get accused of witchcraft. Because, of course, success must be sorcery. Historians still argue whether the classic image of a witch, the hat, the cauldron, the cat, was originally based on alewives. Cauldrons for brewing, cats to chase mice, tall hats to stand out in the market. Stir that together, and you've got the makings of medieval scandal. Back to your breakfast. You're sipping ale and chewing on a hunk of dark bread. It's filling, in that heavy, prick-in-your-gut kind of way. You're not drunk, but you're not thirsty either. Win-win. There were stronger drinks, of course. Mead, fermented honey water, was sweet, rare, and expensive. Wine existed, but was mostly for the rich, the clergy, or people who lived near vineyards. You've tasted wine once. It was red, warm, unsettling. But ale was democratic. Ale was everywhere. And it wasn't just for drinking. Sometimes it went into soups, into bread, into stews. It was flavor, which you desperately needed, since most of your food still tasted like boiled shadows. Still, ale had issues. It spoiled quickly, had to be consumed within days. That's why brewers made small batches, often every other day. No preservatives, no bottling, just a jug, a ladle, and your thirst. You hear someone across the room gag. Bad batch. It happens. You switch jugs. Taverns were the place to drink if you had a coin or two. They weren't glamorous. Dirt floors, long benches, smoke-stained walls, loud, sticky. But they offered company, music, maybe a game of dice, and ale, lots of ale. If you had a few extra pennies, you might spring for spiced ale, posset, made with hot milk, ale, spices, and eggs. It's what people drank when they were sick, or rich, or both. You, however, are neither. So you stick with your small ale, safe, warm, liquidish. There's also cider, made from apples, obviously. If you lived in an orchard-heavy region, that might be your go-to drink. Sweet, tart, occasionally alcoholic enough to make a goat sing. But apples are seasonal, and pressing them takes tools. Ale remains more reliable. You look out the window. Okay, the hole in the wall, and watch the sun rise. The village is waking. People shuffle about. Someone's already stoking a fire. A child cries. A chicken screams. You stretch again and finish your cup. Is it ideal? No, but it won't poison you. And that's all you can really ask. You rinse the mug with leftover stew water. You wipe it with your sleeve. You tuck it into your bag. It's yours. You guard it like treasure. Because tomorrow morning, when you roll over in your straw and try to forget the dream you had about clean, cold lemonade, you'll reach for it again, and it'll be ale, always ale. The meat was salted. The bread was rock hard. The stew had been bubbling since Tuesday. But you know what might actually scare you? The leftovers. More specifically, how people preserved food in the Middle Ages. You open the pantry door. Not that it's really a door. It's more of a dusty wooden plank balanced against a hole in the wall. Inside, sacks of grain, a few questionable carrots, and something that might be cheese or might be a science experiment. Preserving food in medieval times wasn't optional, it was survival. Without refrigeration, every meal was a race against rot. So people got creative, and by creative, I mean desperate. Let's start with the basics. Salt. Salt was the MVP of medieval kitchens. Rub it on meat, soak fish in it, pack vegetables in it. It didn't just season, it dehydrated, killed bacteria, and slowed decay. It was so valuable, people were paid in salt. That's right. Salary literally comes from salarium, Latin for salt money. But too much salt? Now you've got food that's more mineral than meal. That hunk of beef from last month? It's basically a meat brick, so dry it echoes. You soak it in water for hours, then boil it for eternity. Still chewy, still aggressive. Next up, smoking. Not you smoking, though you probably smell like a chimney, but meat. Hang it over the hearth for days, letting smoke curl around it. Like an ancient marinade, it adds flavor, dries the surface, and keeps flies away. Usually, sometimes, your house permanently smells like smoked pork and ash. Honestly, not the worst. Then there's drying. You've seen it done with fruit, though it's rare. Apples, plums, even herbs, all strung up near the fire or laid on rooftops like little food sacrifices. Dried food stores better, as long as the bugs don't get there first. You remember helping hang strips of venison in the rafters last fall. You also remember waking up to find a rat chewing on one. You locked eyes. He didn't flinch. Pickling was another favorite. Vinegar was hard to make but powerful. People pickled vegetables, fruits, even fish. You'd bite into a turnip and taste equal parts sour and self-preservation. Not refreshing, but definitely intense. And let's not forget fermentation, that noble process of letting food rot on purpose until it becomes something delicious or horrifying. Sauerkraut, sourdough, ale, cheese. They're all just controlled decay. You cross your fingers and hope for the delicious side. Sometimes food was buried, not in shame, but in clay pots sealed with fat or ash, then stuck underground to keep cool. It worked surprisingly well, except when it didn't. You've unearthed more than one jar full of moldy soup that definitely had plans of its own. Cellars were essential, cool, dark, and hopefully rodent-proof. Root vegetables, grains, and salted goods lived there. But mold grew fast, and bugs grew faster. You once opened a barley sack and unleashed a small ecosystem. Ice houses existed, but only for the elite. Huge pits lined with straw, filled with winter snow, kept behind thick stone. The rest of us? We made do with cold corners and crossed fingers. And when things did go bad, you got creative. Scrape off the mold, reboil the meat, add vinegar to the stew. Some folks believed bad smells could be smoked away. Others just ignored it. Did people get sick? Constantly. Food poisoning was normal. You'd eat something off, spend a day praying, then carry on. You probably didn't even know it was food poisoning. You blamed it on sin, or a curse, or Jeffrey. Again. Historians still argue whether people just had stronger guts, or if the average medieval immune system was held together by sheer stubbornness. Some preservation methods were more superstition than science, like tying herbs above the pantry door to keep away evil spirits and, hopefully, mice, or rubbing onions on meat to pull out the rot, or chanting prayers over the cheese crock. You've done all three. The cheese still exploded. In noble homes, preservation was elegant. Fine jars, exotic spices, glass bottles. They had staff to rotate food stores, detect spoilage, and blame the scullery maid when things went wrong. You sniff and hope. You remember that one winter when all the salted pork went green. Someone swore it was safe if you just boiled it long enough. You all ate it anyway. 3 people fainted. Jeffrey blamed the moon. Even eggs had tricks. People dipped them in lime water or buried them in ash to keep them fresh. It sort of worked. Sort of. And milk? Forget it. If it wasn't turned into butter or cheese within hours, it curdled. You tried to store some once. It hissed at you. At the end of the day, medieval food wasn't meant to be fresh. It was meant to last. Taste was secondary. Texture was irrelevant. Color optional. You stare at the pot simmering on the hearth. Tonight's stew includes salted beef, last week's cabbage, and some turnips that were going soft. It's technically food. It might be delicious. Or not. You lift the lid and stir. The smell isn't offensive. That's good enough. You ladle it into a bowl, watching the steam rise. Across from you, the bread-staring girl from earlier is watching again. She nods. You nod back. She knows. You both know. Sometimes, staying alive means scraping off the green bit. You're invited to a feast tonight, not just any meal. This is a noble stable, the kind with candles, carvings, and food that doesn't taste like punishment. You walk in, your mouth already watering, and then you see it. A whole peacock, roasted, reassembled, wearing its own feathers. Beak wide open, like it's still screaming. Welcome to medieval high cuisine, where nobles flex their wealth through food that's mostly weird, occasionally terrifying, and always impractical. The rich didn't just eat to survive. They performed it. Food was a show. The more exotic, the better. The more over the top, the more powerful you looked. And sometimes it had nothing to do with taste. Tonight, the long table groans under the weight of golden pastries, glazed meats and jellies, molded into castles. A full roast boar sits in the center, an apple wedged in its mouth like a cruel joke. You eye a pie the size of a helmet. Inside, a surprise. It could be venison. It could be frogs. It could be both. Historians still argue whether these entremets were actually meant to be eaten or just stared at. Someone slices into it, and a flock of live birds flies out. You drop your spoon. Yes, that happened. People once baked live animals into pastry shells for dramatic reveals. Did it taste good? Irrelevant. Was it safe? Doubtful. Was it extra? Absolutely. The rich had access to foods you'd only heard of in songs. Figs, oranges, almonds, sugar. Imported spices turned their kitchens into fragrant laboratories. Their cooks, trained professionals, crafted menus days in advance. Nothing was random. Everything was curated and expensive. You spot a roast swan coated in gold leaf. Not metaphorically, literally. Gold was edible if you didn't care about practicality or digestion. The rich didn't eat to nourish. They ate to dominate, to show they could afford to waste what others died without. You sip from a goblet of wine. It's sharp, dark, and strangely bitter. But it's wine. You've only tasted ale for months. This feels divine. Suddenly a servant brings out a sugar sculpture, a miniature cathedral. You lean forward in awe. The child next to you tries to bite it. The servant slaps her hand. You pretend not to notice. These feasts were filled with subtleties, not small things, but theatrical, symbolic dishes. A roasted deer with antlers dipped in silver. A fish presented with a human face carved into dough. A pudding shaped like a castle. If it made people gasp, it passed. Behind the scenes, the kitchen is chaos. Fires blaze, knives flash. Multiple courses, sometimes dozens, are prepared simultaneously. The head cook barks orders. Apprentices sweat over stews. Spices are measured with the care of alchemists. It's not peaceful. It's a battleground. The war against blandness, boredom, and status envy. Meanwhile, at your end of the table, you nibble a duck leg soaked in saffron and cinnamon. It's tender, strange, and oddly sweet. You're not sure you like it, but you respect it. Across the hall, someone's vomiting into a corner. Feasting often led to overindulgence. It was common, expected even. That's why noble halls had buckets in the shadows. You're beginning to understand why. And oh, don't forget the drunkenness. Wine flows endlessly. Nobles drink between every course. Toasts, boasts, singing, more toasts. It starts refined, then devolves into chaos. Someone's challenging a bishop to an arm wrestling match. Someone else is asleep on a roast goose. You suddenly miss your pottage, because here's the thing. Noble feasts were grand, but they were also grotesque. Too rich, too fatty, too much. And the food? Half the time it was flavored with so many spices, you couldn't tell what you were eating. That was the point. Display, not clarity. You've heard of jelly made from fish bones, of sweet pies filled with rabbit, dates, and anchovies, of drinks laced with rosewater, sugar, and crushed pearls. Historians still argue whether anyone actually enjoyed these concoctions, or if everyone was just pretending for clout. Even the tableware was a show of class. Pewter dishes for the moderately rich, silver for the elite, and trenchers, those thick slices of stale bread served underneath meat to soak up the juices. Peasants got the leftovers, dogs got the trenchers, and everyone else got gout. Eventually, the feast ends, or at least pauses. The fire burns low. Someone is asleep in the pie. A minstrel is playing a lute with only one string. You push away your golden chicken and reach for a slice of tart made with quince and rosemary. It's weirdly good. Then someone starts the next course. You groan, because while peasant meals were boring, noble meals could be endless. 14, 18, 30 courses, each more elaborate than the last, each testing the limits of digestion and dignity. You stagger outside, head spinning, stomach confused. You've never been fuller, or more tired, or more certain that sometimes simple really is better. Because while nobles feast with flair, peasants survive with grit. And right now, all you want is a spoonful of lukewarm gruel and a nap. You wake up with your face stuck to a wooden bench and a faint taste of cornstarch still lingering on your tongue. Your stomach is confused, your head is spinning, and your dignity probably still curled up under the feasting table next to that guy who tried to joust a roast boar. Time to go home, back to your corner of reality, back to normal food, which means no cutlery. You grab a piece of dark bread and tear it open. Steam rises. You dip it into a cold, greasy stew and scoop some up. You're not being rude. You're eating the medieval way. Because in this world, table manners are optional. Or more precisely, still evolving. You eat with your hands. Everyone does. Even nobles, even bishops. In fact, using a fork would make people look at you sideways, if they even knew what it was. Forks existed. Kind of. In the East, they were common. But in Europe, suspicious, foreign, untrustworthy. Tiny trident from Satan. Kind of suspicious. Historians still argue when the fork actually gained popularity. Some say the 11th century, others say the 16th. You won't see one for at least another few hundred dinners. Knives? Ah, now those are everywhere, but not dinner knives. You bring your own knife to a meal. Tuck it in your belt like a proper adult. It's multi-purpose. Cutting meat, slicing bread, defending your cabbage from Jeffrey. Knives are personal, sharp, used for everything. You eat straight off the blade if you're brave, or slightly unhinged. As for spoons, they exist, sure. But again, personal property. You don't show up to dinner and expect a matched set of utensils. You carry your spoon carved from wood, slightly warped, stained with a lifetime of stew. You once lost yours and had to borrow someone else's. Never again. That was the day you tasted soap, sadness, and possibly mildew. You sit cross-legged by the hearth, slurping soup from your spoon and tearing bread with your teeth. Across from you, someone gnaws on a drumstick with both hands. Beside you, a toddler has dunked their entire hand into a bowl of beans and is licking their fingers like it's gourmet. It's messy, loud, communal. Dignity takes a backseat to practicality. There are no individual plates, just shared bowls. Trencher bread, if you're lucky. Hands flying in, grabbing what they can, wiping them on tunics, occasionally sneezing over everything. You look around the room. This isn't chaos. This is culture. The idea of table manners is still forming. Some nobles have started using napkins. Sort of. Others prefer the wipe on the dog method. You've seen lords lick their fingers, belch proudly, and throw chicken bones over their shoulder like a victory dance. Someone once told you that manners were invented to show rank, not politeness. And now you believe it. The higher the rank, the more rules. The lower the rank, the more practical. But everyone agrees on one thing. don't eat with your left hand, not because of superstition, though there's plenty of that, but because, well, let's just say there's no toilet paper in the 14th century. Left hand will go unclean. Always. Forever. You try not to think about it as your neighbor offers you a hunk of bread he just tore off with that very hand. You smile politely and say you're full. In noble homes, etiquette becomes a tool. Dishes are passed in specific directions. You're not allowed to speak with your mouth full. Servants refill goblets only after a nod. Napkins are embroidered. Soup is poured into gold bowls. In your home, you just hope the dog doesn't steal your meal while you're distracted. Still, even peasants had unspoken rules. Don't reach across the bowl. Don't double dip. Don't take the best piece unless offered. Always let elders eat first. Don't chew loudly unless you're really proud of your chewing. And never steal from the stew pot when no one's looking. That gets you shunned, or tackled, or Jeffrey'd. Occasionally, traveling nobles or clergy would grace your home with a visit. That's when you are expected to clean up, use better spoons, and pretend like you didn't just lick stew off your wrist 5 minutes ago. You tried using a borrowed silver spoon once. It felt like holding a weapon, heavy, cold, impersonal. You gave it back and quietly missed your warped wooden one. As the meal ends, you toss the used bones to the dog, wipe your hands on your tunic, and lean back. Someone's already scraping out the pot. Someone else is licking a spoon like it owes them money. You don't feel refined, but you do feel full. Table manners may not exist here in the way you imagine. No folded napkins, no polished silver, no whispered compliments about the vinaigrette. But there's a strange, messy grace to it all. Hands feeding hands, bread passed between friends, a hot bowl shared with someone who doesn't have one of their own. It's not elegant, but it's honest, and sometimes, when you're lucky, that's enough. You're standing in the doorway of the kitchen again, or what passes for a kitchen. It's hot, loud, dangerous. The air is thick with smoke and something vaguely acidic. Something is sizzling in a corner, and something else is definitely on fire. You're not sure either is intentional, because in the Middle Ages, the kitchen wasn't just where food was made. It was where danger lived. Let's get one thing straight. You didn't cook inside your house unless you absolutely had to. If you were poor, which you are, you cooked over the hearth, right there in the middle of your single-room home. It doubled as a heat source, light source, and occasional accident generator. One wrong step in the dark, you're explaining to your neighbor why your tunic is smoldering. But the real kitchens, those in manors, castles, monasteries, they were separate buildings entirely. And for good reason. They were full of chaos. Imagine a long, narrow room with low ceilings, a roaring central fire, and soot coating every surface like medieval wallpaper. Smoke chokes the air. Ash drifts lazily from the rafters. The walls are dark and sticky. Everything smells like charred onions and singed beard. People are shouting. Meat is turning on giant spits. Pots bubble, foam hiss. Knives fly figuratively and sometimes literally. It's a symphony of near disasters, and you're just trying not to lose a toe. Kitchens had no chimneys, only holes in the roof to sort of let the smoke out. You breathe through your sleeve and pretend it's helping. Your eyes sting. Your hair already smells like a smoked duck. And there's not even duck on the menu. Fires were fed with wood, which meant chopping, hauling, stacking, feeding. If the fire went out, the meal was ruined. If it burned too hot, the bread caught fire. If it smoked too much, people passed out. You remember last month's feast prep, when the oven collapsed, half-baked pies, ash-covered geese, a furious cook. The disaster was legendary. Jeffrey still insists it was sabotage. Fire control was an art form. You had to know how to bank coals, shift pots, dampen flames, all without thermometers, timers, or, science. Just instinct, sweat, and the occasional screamed prayer. And then there were the accidents. Burns were common, cuts too. Boiling water scalded legs. Oil popped and scarred hands. You saw someone lose a fingernail to a cheese grater made from hammered nails. One cook had a permanent limp from stepping on a roasting spit. And the kitchen wasn't just fire and blades. It was alive, with animals, chickens flapping in corners, pigs snorting under benches, cats prowling for scraps, rats dancing like they owned the place. You once saw a dog walk out with an entire loaf of bread in its mouth. No one stopped it. You kind of respected it. Cleanliness? Well, let's just say hygiene was conceptual. People rinsed things when they remembered. Knives were wiped on aprons. Cutting boards were shared between raw meat and fresh herbs. The floor was the floor. If something fell, you picked it up, maybe blew on it, and kept going. You're pretty sure you've eaten food that touched at least 3 different surfaces and possibly 1 rat. Still, despite the chaos, meals got made. People were fed. There was a rhythm to it, a grimy ballet of survival. You think of the massive cauldrons, hung over iron hooks, swung in and out of the fire, full of soup, stew, or mystery. You think of the bake ovens, stone-lined caves of heat that took hours to warm and could burn a loaf in seconds. You once helped bake rye bread. You misjudged the coals and set a dozen loaves on fire. The smoke cloud was visible for miles. The local priest called it apocalyptic. Even utensils were risky. Spits the size of swords, cleavers with no handles, griddles that wobbled, ladles carved from hollowed wood and held together with hope. The kitchen staff worked like warriors. The head cook, usually large, loud, and terrifying, kept everything moving. His assistants chopped, stirred, hauled, and occasionally yelled for water when something exploded. And it wasn't just food prep. The kitchen had to make hundreds of meals a day for nobles, servants, guards, guests, travelers, stable boys. There was always someone hungry, always someone complaining, always someone asking for extra gravy. You once saw a monk ask for just a bit more duck. The cook gave him a ladle to the chest instead. When things went right, meals were spectacular. When they went wrong, people got burned, food got ruined, and the dog got dinner. And the worst part? You couldn't leave. The kitchen had to be watched constantly. Fires didn't wait. Porridge didn't stir itself. Bread dough needed timing. Cheese, curds needed turning. If you stepped away for even a moment, something boiled over or boiled down to a blackened crust. So you stayed. You wiped sweat from your brow with a sleeve that smelled like onions. You stirred. You turned. You added more water. You fanned the fire. You whispered a curse when the beans stuck again. And when the meal was done, you collapsed by the hearth with blistered hands, burnt eyebrows, and the satisfaction of having cooked something technically edible. Dinner was served, barely, and the kitchen lived to fight another day. You've made it through another meal. Somehow. Your eyebrows are still singed from the fire. Your hands smell like onions and old ash. And as you sit down to rest your bones, you notice someone scratching their arm with the kind of desperation that makes you nervous. Yep, here it comes. The plague, the parasites, and the oops I ate that moments. Because in the Middle Ages, food didn't just fill you, it also tried to kill you. Let's begin with the charming creatures living in your food, or rather, inside the food you already ate. Because intestinal worms, extremely common. You probably have one now. Don't worry, they're quiet. They came from undercooked meat, unwashed vegetables, bad water, or simply existing in a world without soap. People learned to live with them, or they thought they had demons in their bellies. Historians still argue whether treatments helped or just made things worse. Then there's moldy bread. You know those lovely ergot-infected rye loaves we mentioned earlier? Yeah, that wasn't just unpleasant. It could cause hallucinations, seizures, even death. Whole villages experienced outbreaks of what was called St. Anthony's fire. People convulsing, screaming, seeing things, limbs blackening. Not ideal for a dinner party, and no one had microscopes. Germ theory? A distant dream. You thought disease came from bad air, from sin, from drinking cold water while sweating, from Jeffrey's evil eye. Never from your favorite turnip. Let's talk botulism, that deadly bacteria that thrives in improperly stored meat and sealed containers. Medieval folks didn't know it existed, but they definitely knew the feeling. Eating a leftover pie and slowly realizing they couldn't move their face. Your best friend once died after licking a pickled egg that smelled funny. You never forget that smell. And what about foraged mushrooms? You've been warned. Some mushrooms fill your belly, others stop your heart. And since your plant identification skills are vaguely hopeful, every mushroom stew is basically Russian roulette with extra dirt. You remember the local herbalist, wrinkled, wise, muttering to plants, telling you, whitecap means safe, unless it's not. Comforting. And then there's rotten meat. You know the trick. If it's green, scrape it. If it smells bad, boil it harder. If it moves, blink slowly and act like you didn't see it. Salt helps sometimes. Vinegar, maybe. Faith, essential. You've eaten things that you're still digesting months later. A sausage that twitched, a pigeon that looked surprised, a stew that tasted warm and vaguely angry. Remember the cheese that hissed. Moving on. Contamination was also a daily threat. Cross-contamination wasn't just a culinary faux pas. It was a lifestyle. The same knife sliced raw meat and your apple. The cutting board was the floor. The dog licked the pot before you did. Yum. Washing hands, optional. Washing dishes, rare. Washing vegetables. Who has that kind of water? You once saw someone rinse lettuce in the same bucket used for laundry. He shrugged and said, "It's clean now." You haven't eaten lettuce since. Let's not forget rats. They were everywhere. In the grain, in the cheese, in the stew. Sometimes on purpose. Rat meat was eaten in lean years, and they carried fleas. Fleas carried plague. Plague carried death. A lot of it. The Black Death wasn't just a nightmare. It was reality. Sweeping across towns, villages, families. You watched whole households vanish. The smell of decay lingering in the streets. People avoiding each other, avoiding food, avoiding hope. And it often started with a meal. Someone ate something bad, or touched something bad, or stood too close to someone coughing over their porridge. The sickness came fast. Fever, vomiting, black sores. Then, silence. You learned to keep your distance, to boil everything, to pray over your stew, to avoid strange cheeses, strange meats, and especially strange travelers offering pies. But not all sickness came from disease. Sometimes it came from the cure. People treated food-borne illness with herbs, leeches, vomit-inducing drinks, or fasting. One doctor told you to wear a garlic clove on your ankle. Another suggested bloodletting. On a full moon, of course. You tried both. You still got sick. One time, you tried to cleanse your body by eating only onions and salt for 3 days. You don't talk about those days anymore. Yet somehow, you survived. You've dodged death by mushroom. You've outlived 5 waves of stomach flu. You've only hallucinated twice from bread mold, and one of those times was kind of fun. And now, you check your food like a soldier checks straps. Is it moving? Is it green? Did Jeffrey make it? You've got instincts. You know the warning signs. And if all else fails, boil it again. Boil everything. Always. Because in a world without germ theory, your soup is your shield. You wake up to the sound of your stomach arguing with itself. Again, it's not empty. It's just confused. Because last night's stew was mostly cabbage. The night before, cabbage again. But before that, a glimmer of memory, a bean, just one. You stretch your legs and glance at the larder. It's not promising. A few onions, one sad carrot, and a turnip that looks like it's giving up. You sigh. This is what survival looks like. Feasting when you can. Fasting when you must. Because in the Middle Ages, famine wasn't an exception. It was a rhythm. Food was seasonal, inconsistent, and utterly dependent on things you couldn't control, like weather, or insects, or war, or taxes, or rats, or that one summer when nothing grew and everyone panicked. You lived in constant fluctuation. Times of plenty, which meant second helpings, and times of hunger, which meant drinking hot water and pretending it was soup. Welcome to the feast or famine lifestyle. When harvest was good, you celebrated. You baked extra bread. You salted meat. You shared. Laughter echoed. Stew pots overflowed. People sang. But part of you always knew it wouldn't last. Because winter was coming every year. And with it, the hungry gap. That cruel stretch between the last of the preserved food and the first signs of spring. It could last weeks or months. That's when things got desperate. You learned to stretch everything. One onion became flavor for 10 meals. A single egg fed 2. You soaked stale bread, scraped bones, stewed skins. You chopped the green parts off rotting turnips and hoped the black bits were just surface mold. You tried not to eat your seed grain. You tried not to dig into the next season's reserves. But when your child cried from hunger, you compromised. You always did. Some families had recipes for famine food: barley paste, dried nettles, acorn flour pancakes that tasted like ground bitterness, and tree bark. You chewed them anyway, and still you remembered the good times, the festivals, the weddings, the rare moments when food was everywhere. When someone slaughtered a pig, when a fish cart came through town, when bread was fresh and butter was spread thick. Those moments carried you through the lean months. Even church calendars reflected this rhythm. Lent, a structured famine, a spiritual excuse for eating less, though the poor were already experts in fasting. Feast days, opportunities to eat a bit more, laugh a bit louder, and forget how uncertain food really was. You learned to eat opportunistically. If you saw an apple, you ate it. If a rabbit crossed your path, you chased it. If someone offered you a A bowl of stew, you didn't ask questions. You hoarded crumbs, saved grease, hid your last piece of cheese in the rafters until the rats found it first. Historians still debate how often true deadly famine struck. Some say every generation, others say it was more localized. But the psychological hunger, the constant awareness of how thin the line was between full and finished, that was everywhere. Even the rich felt it, just differently. Nobles hoarded grain, bought up stores, and rationed it to keep control. A lord who kept his people fed earned loyalty. One who let them starve earned knives in the dark. Food was power, and hunger was leverage. You remember that spring when the baker started adding sawdust to the bread? People complained, but still bought it. You remember the priest blessing moldy beans so they'd nourish the soul. You remember eating a stew with so many nettles, your tongue tingled for a week. And when things got really bad, people left. They packed what little they had, kissed their loved ones, and walked. Some to beg, some to steal, some to die. You stayed, barely. You learned the signs. Thinner animals, smaller loaves, colder stares. And you learned to fast, not as piety, but as habit. You mastered the art of pretending not to be hungry, of chewing slowly, of letting your children eat first, of skipping breakfast and calling it a choice. And when spring came, when the first green shoots peeked through the frost, and your soup tasted like hope again, you cried, just a little, quietly, because you made it. You lived through another famine, another winter, another year of scraping, boiling, rationing, and hoping. You lived. And now, as you spoon the last of the cabbage stew into your bowl and sniff it with cautious optimism, you say a silent prayer to whatever force gave you this day's meal. Then you eat, slowly, carefully, gratefully, because you know, next month, next year, it could all be gone again. You're back at the table again, if it can be called that. Eating something vaguely brown, definitely boiled, and not worth describing in too much detail. You glance around the room and suddenly realize something strange. You all eat the same thing, but not for the same reasons. Welcome to the unspoken truth of medieval food. It wasn't just about hunger. It was about hierarchy, identity, and divine judgment. Because in this world, food was status. Everything on your plate, or missing from it, told the world who you were. You eat rye bread, you're poor. Wheat bread, you're privileged. White manchet bread, you're royalty or clergy. And if you're lucky enough to get meat regularly, then you're probably sitting far from where you're sitting now. Even the way you ate spoke volumes. You eat from a shared bowl, lower class, a personal dish, rising, silver utensils. You've arrived, gold goblets. You've arrived and brought dancers. And there's more. Food wasn't just class, it was faith. The The church shaped your calendar. You didn't just eat when you were hungry, you ate around religion. Feast days and fast days. Days when meat was sinful. Days when fish was holy. Days when you were expected to eat nothing and act grateful for the opportunity. You'd think the poor would be excused, but no. Fasting was enforced across all classes. If you were starving already, too bad. God still expected you to skip meat on Friday. You once had a conversation with a monk who insisted that a squirrel counted as a fish because it lived in trees, which reach toward heaven. Historians still argue whether people truly believed all this or were just trying not to get excommunicated with a mouthful of stew. Monasteries, by the way, were strange food utopias. Monks ate better than peasants, sometimes better than nobles. They had lands, resources, and time. They grew their own food, brewed ale, aged cheese. Their fasts were structured, their meals measured, their kitchens calm. You once helped deliver onions to an abbey. You've never forgotten the smell wafting from the cloister kitchen. Fresh herbs, warm bread, butter. You almost cried. You wonder if you should become a monk. Then you remember the rules. No marriage, early mornings, constant prayer. Also, Jeffrey tried it once. They kicked him out after a week for hoarding biscuits. But beyond monasteries and manor houses, food was also superstition. People believed certain dishes could cure disease, influence dreams, even predict the future. Eat leeks for strength, carrots for lust, fish for intelligence. That one clearly didn't catch on. You've seen people bury food at crossroads to ward off spirits. You've watched someone pour milk on a doorstep to feed the fae. You once ate a stew seasoned with blessed salt and had nightmares for 3 days. Coincidence? Probably. Still weird. And then there were food laws, sumptuary laws. Yes. Rules about what you could and could not eat based on your class. Certain meats, reserved for nobility. Certain spices, restricted. It was illegal. Illegal. For a commoner to serve peacock at a wedding. Not that you were going to, but still. You've heard of people being punished for eating above their station, like enjoying a noble dish without permission. It wasn't just rude, it was treasonous appetite. But perhaps the strangest thing, sometimes people chose to go hungry, not because there wasn't food, but because they believed in the power of fasting. Flagellants who marched town to town, starving in the name of repentance. Saints who lived on nothing but herbs and rainwater. Anchorites who sealed themselves in stone cells and refused food except for communion. You once knew a woman who didn't eat for 7 days after her child died. She said it brought her closer to heaven. You believed her. Because in a world full of hard bread and harder truths, food was deeply, disturbingly spiritual. You eat or don't. To be pure, to be worthy, to be seen, to be forgiven. Even in death, food followed you. Wills often included bequests of food, a loaf for every mourner, a cask of ale for the gravediggers. Give my best salted pork to Father Bernard. Yes, that was a real thing. You saw it written, in ink, on a scrap of vellum. It made you think. Maybe food was how people stayed alive, not just in the stomach, but in memory. You chew slowly now, thinking about the girl who used to trade you apples. Gone. The baker who always added extra crumbs when you couldn't pay. Gone. Your mother's stew, watery, overcooked, perfect. Gone too. But in some way, still here. On your tongue, in your bones. Because food wasn't just calories. It was culture. It was class. It was faith. It was grief. It was joy. It was survival in spoonfuls. And as you finish your bowl and lick the last drop from your spoon, you feel it. You're not just eating history. You are history. The fire is low. The stew pot is empty. The bread's been eaten down to its crust. You lean back against the stone wall, the ache in your legs slowly giving way to the ache behind your eyes. The room is quiet now. You made it through another day. And it's only now, in this stillness, that the thought creeps in. What did food actually mean to you? Because yes, it sucked. It was hard, bland, dangerous, sometimes laughable, often tragic. But still, you survived on it. You shared it. And sometimes, just sometimes, you even celebrated it. Food was never just food in the Middle Ages. It was your place in the world. It reminded you of what you didn't have, but also of who you had around you. You think of meals eaten shoulder to shoulder, in silence, bowls passed hand to hand. That one time, a neighbor brought you a warm barley cake during a snowstorm. And that other time, you gave the last of your stew to a stranger because they looked hungrier than you. You remember hunger, yes, but you also remember the little moments of kindness served on wooden spoons. And the rituals, blessing the bread before slicing it, saving the best piece for an elder, feeding the sick before yourself. You didn't read that in a book. You learned it around the fire, through hunger, through love, through habit. You remember how your hands learned to tear bread just right, how you stirred stew without thinking, how you could taste the difference between needs more water and it's done without even speaking. This was your language. No spices, no sauces. Just survival and ritual survival at that. And yes, you complained. You dreamed of roasted meats, sweet pies, fruit that wasn't half rotten. You imagined feasts where you didn't have to fight flies or chase away the dog. But now, looking back, you realize something kind of wild. You found a way to love food, despite how awful it was. Not because it was tasty, but because it brought people together. Because it got you through. Because it reminded you daily that you're still here. And isn't that something? Even now, with your fingers sticky from the last crust of ale-soaked bread, you feel a little grateful, not for the taste, but for the act of eating, for the story it told, for the fact that, despite all the danger and discomfort, you fed yourself and the people you loved. The food sucked, but the moments didn't. Not all of them. You close your eyes. You let the fire warm your face. You think of turnips, trenchers, gruel, and goat cheese that screamed a little. And you smile. Because medieval food may have tried to kill you, but you, stubborn, scrappy, sauce-deprived you, lived anyway. Now the fire is just glowing embers. Your bowl is scraped clean. Your stomach doesn't hurt. For once, it's quiet, like the house, like the village, like your mind. The night air slips in through the cracks in the wooden shutters, cool and soft. You pull the blanket tighter. Scratchy wool, heavy, familiar. You've survived another day in a time when every meal was a gamble and every bite a quiet victory. The chickens are asleep. The stew pot rests. Even Jeffrey, somehow, has stopped talking. You take a deep breath. Let the smoke fade. Let the cold earth beneath you feel less hard. Let your thoughts slow. You are not hungry. You are not waiting. You are just here. A simple meal, a slow fire, a quiet room. In a time when the world was louder and darker than you can imagine, this is peace. And maybe, just maybe, this is how people found joy in spite of it all. Not through flavor, but through presence, through being together, through surviving something unthinkable, through finding warmth where there should be none. Let that feeling settle into your bones. Let the hunger stories drift into dreams. You've chewed your way through history, laughed at it, cringed, gagged, maybe. But now it's time to rest. The gruel is gone. The kitchen is cold. The spoon is tucked beneath your bowl. Sleep well, weary traveler. And tomorrow, maybe more turnips.